There are very few things, in fact, that are certain here today in America circa 2023, with an ever changing political, social, and economic landscape. There is much to be unpacked and analyzed to understand, or even to begin to just wrap your head around everything that is going on just for a bit. And I think one of the great ways to do so is by looking at examples from the not so distant past, maybe more distant in other segments, but in this particular one, a sort of similar time of turbulence. And I'm talking about America in the 1960s at the height of the Cold War, with a lot of events going on that we are familiar with, some that were worse than others, such as the Bay of Pigs, the botched attempt to reassert influence and control over Cuba at the time, which was at the moment, ruled by a certain Fidel Castro, whom is the leader and founder of the modern state of Cuba, that to this day is still in a state of tension between the U.S., with recent stories of them working out potentially a deal to have a radio station for China to be put there as an outpost of some kind, which we can talk about in another segment, but it just goes to show that they're still relevant today, and back then even so, arguably more, because of the looming threat that the Soviets had of placing nuclear weapons with the permission of a then friendly communist Cuba. And we can get into that in another segment in itself, but I only mentioned that to underlie some of the very complicated events that were happening that could have meant the difference between the peaceful time that we had between now and then, relatively so. I mean, across the world, there's a lot of things happening that I've talked about in previous segments, and others I haven't even yet, that I definitely need to talk about, that are certainly impacting things and are making people's lives in those areas far less than peaceful. But at least where I grew up in the United States, and most, I say, the Western world, which the U.S. is the leader of after World War II, and has been the unipolar superpower ever since 1991, there has been a consensus of sorts over time that has shifted, but we're living in a time of, a sort of transitory period between, I think, different eras, and we're witnessing those sort of changes unfold in real time. And they manifest not just in our own daily lives through the cost of living and the crisis that we're having across the country with that, but also with, events taking place farther afield, especially within the realm of international relations. And I'd say the 1960s in particular were a part of a similar moment in which we saw political systems fundamentally changing, and the breakdown of what at the time was the ruling coalition of the New Deal, which had since FDR, and afterwards even with a Republican consensus, in the line of Eisenhower and Nixon, which I think were two of the better Republican presidents. I think Nixon was pretty good, actually, for sure, but I could talk about that in another segment. But there was just this consensus, and Nixon famously had said, "We are all Keynesians now," referring to the sort of consensus that both parties had at the time for a sort of more, I'd say, arguably liberal economics, or at least one that believed in strong state intervention and, these sorts of programs that today are still exist, but are kind of under assault, especially from certain financial interests, especially within the Republican Party today. But the Democrats, I'd say, also have some responsibility in that. I mean, they are willing to make compromises, I think, for areas that should be red lines, like when it comes to Social Security and Medicare, but we could talk about those in other segments. And when it comes to, I think, the turbulence, I think we need to sometimes look at things on the micro level and look at particular figures that sort of encapsulates these moments in times. The Soviet Union had Nikolai Khrushchev at the time, and I mean, I think Nikolai, I believe. Maybe, I mean, I might have been butchering this, but I know it's Khrushchev's his last name. I should have probably just said at the time Secretary Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union for the time. And then you had John F. Kennedy here in the United States. And I want to talk about today JFK and his correspondence at the time, and another issue that was sort of tertiary relative to the Cuban Missile Crisis that I just touched on, but was concurrent, and if anything, today leads us to an issue that actually is far from tertiary in contrast to its position before, which is the still unanswered, fully unanswered Taiwan question, or the sort of cross-strait dispute between the ROC and the PRC, respectively, Taipei and Beijing. Ever since 1949, I talked about in a previous segment, which I'll link below, there has been this sort of unfinished Chinese Civil War, much like the Korean Civil War, there is sort of this frozen conflict here with, unresolved tensions and a very sort of, relative to my lifetime, long lasting, but not really secure peace where, you're seeing right now tensions ramp up across East Asia and the world, over, especially if you're looking at Eastern Europe. And I talked about Ukraine. I need to do it again in another segment coming up. But just to mention how much the world really is, we're entering a new era in so many ways. But I think really to understand where we're going and to make sense of the present moment, looking back, as I mentioned, to events in the past, which I'm about to do in this case, will help us and are especially salient in sort of navigating and seeing maybe not exactly what happened, one for one, but drawing parallels and gaining wisdom from the past leaders from different countries, especially here in America, past presidents such as JFK, considering his larger-than-life legacy and the fact that him and a particular Chiang Kai-shek at the time, who was the leader of what was Free China or the Republic of China on Taiwan since its ouster in 1949 from the mainland, and with the PRC, the People's Republic of China, to this day being the de facto and pretty much legitimate government on the mainland, and their dispute and their unfinished claim and desire to reunite, the entirety of the historical Sinosphere, which includes Taiwan especially. But, that sort of thing I've talked about in another segment. Definitely need to talk about it again, as there have been developments since, of course, as this is an ongoing and ever-developing situation. But I only wanted to mention these figures because they, I think, help us gain further insights. And maybe it's not one for one, but I say certain patterns, especially if you think about the fact that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., one of the figures who I mentioned briefly in my past segment, who I'm really not a huge fan of, but for certain is invoking and running on much of the clout that still exists of the Kennedy legacy and the Kennedy political dynasty, which, along with the Clintons and Bushes, are among the most contemporary and relevant, and recently of highly prestige and consideration of the mores of our society, at least in America, at least in the elite circles, which I'm not a part of, but is, the ruling class of the country, as it is in many cases. There's different variants, but at least here, there is this sort of modern continuity with, you see Robert F. Kennedy running in America much on his legacy of his uncle, and also his own father, who is, of course, Robert or Bobby F. Kennedy, the namesake of the son who I mentioned earlier, and is the younger brother of John F. Kennedy, whom this subject matter in this particular segment is going to be particularly focusing on. But of course, it's important to keep in mind that these figures are more so a microcosm of the broader events that shaped their times and circumstances for better and for worse. And in the case of JFK, certainly for, if you're going to consider his ultimate end, in a lot of ways personally for him, for worse, as he met an untimely and one of which that still captures the imaginations for what could have been if he had not been assassinated in Dallas on that fateful day in 1963. There's a lot of intersections between the domestic and foreign policy matters of that time, of course, and in this particular case, I'm going to be discussing more so the foreign policy impacts of that era. And I'll definitely come back to the domestic matters, which certainly are important considering how, in a lot of ways, I would say the 60s has probably been the last time comparable to the times that we're living in today, which had such an uproar and such a significant change in the political paradigm for the world entirely, but particularly the United States, as it was still sorting out itself in the wake of the end of World War II and being thrust in the midst of the Cold War, facing off as America was against the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, which it led, as well as the threat of Maoist China, which had recently, in the 50s, consolidated and overcome the Kuomintang that had fled to Taiwan, which actually brings me to the other figure in this segment who I'm going to be mainly talking about, and contrasting and well comparing the correspondence at the time between the two, of which I mentioned John F. Kennedy in the past, but in the case of Taiwan, its contemporary ruler at that time, whom was none other than Chiang Kai-shek, who had ruled over Taiwan from 1949 after being, famously defeated in the mainland during the Chinese Civil War, and fleeing to Taiwan, where there is this sort of status quo frozen conflict type situation, similar to what's going on in Korea and what looks like it's shaping up in Ukraine if things don't change significantly from at the time of this recording taking place in the summer of 2023. We'll get back to that as well, but I mention all these things because they, I think, are all part of a linear progression in history that can be understood if we contextualize the different events and then look at them not as in a vacuum, but as collectively part of a broader narrative. And one of which I think, when you zoom into the particulars, can give a lot of helpful insight in making sense in navigating where we're going to be going in the future in today's terms when it comes to the modern political scene in America and the world. But also, obviously, since we're as much, today is the present, but for the present moment, we are the future if you're talking about the people of the 1960s. We're their future and they're our past. And in the future, we are someone else's, past. And for the people talking, if someone looks at this, in 100 years from now, in 21, 23, me speaking right now, I am part of the broader past that the present at that time will be able to refer to, hopefully, if the internet is still intact and archived with documents and videos and podcasts such as this and others, hopefully. Provided that there isn't a nuclear catastrophe. I mean, who knows, considering the direction things are going in. But that's why I want to cover segments like this and other things in the realm of international relations, because it is so fascinating to see our predicament and to understand how precarious things are, especially now in the 2020s, as we're sort of leaving this sort of post-historical, sort of what we thought was the post-historical era where, it was like the end of history. As I mentioned in previous segments, Francis Fukuyama's famous thesis that he had retracted, that after the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, that America would be, along with its political, ideology at the time, they championed neoliberalism, some call it liberalism, I guess modern liberalism. I mean, we could debate the terms, but I'm sure you all understand what I'm talking about. But that sort of debate, whether that from then until the future, would this be the sort of end point of the historical trajectory for mankind? And clearly that's not the case, as anyone who's tuning in and is keeping up with events like I am obviously understand. But it's good to keep in note that was not too long ago a growing consensus. And obviously there's events now in real time challenging that, with the COVID pandemic, the subsequent chaos in Ukraine, and the ongoing tensions that are still to this day happening in Taiwan, which is why I'm bringing up what's going on with Taiwan in this segment in the 60s, because understanding what happened back then can help paint a picture of where we're at right now and what might happen in the near future, as well as in the distant future ahead, which is what I think is something we should be all thinking about increasingly as tensions continue to rise, and looming deadlines in terms of historical milestone dates such as 2049, or even the more micro sort of demographic issues that are facing both America and China in different respects, are increasingly exacerbating the ongoing tensions, as well as other things that we can talk about and I've talked about in other segments, but just to note those. Another modern parallel also to keep in mind would actually be, as I mentioned, Chiang Kai-shek, and we'll get further into his relationship with John F. Kennedy in this article that I found, actually, that I'll link below, but I'm going to read and then provide my analysis of in a moment. But his grandson, or one of his, it's disputed because I think it came from one of his son's illegitimate offsprings, as Chiang Ching-kuo actually had a mistress. He had famously, like Syngman Rhee in Korea, who had an Austrian wife, had a wife from Russia from his time studying abroad in Moscow, during the period where there was cooperation between the Kuomintang and the then burgeoning Communist Party of China in the 1920s, during their, temporarily united front before the Shanghai Massacre and things went south. Chiang Kai-shek actually allowed his son to study in Moscow during the beginning of what became, the Soviet Union. And Chiang Ching-kuo at the time actually met his Belarusian wife, whom he then, as I mentioned, had some mistresses in between his tenure as Chiang Kai-shek's son, heir, and obviously a significant figure in his own right due to his connection with his father inside the broader politics of the Republic of China, both when it was on the mainland until 1949, and then following its continual existence as it had been reduced to Taiwan and the islands of the Penghu
and as well as Matsu and Kinmen, which we could talk about. Those islands are actually important today, but in today's context for the geopolitical tensions, it could be the area where when a conflict resumes, potentially if there's a hot conflict, those could potentially be the front lines, which was actually a debate that the Kennedy administration was worried about, as well as the Nixon afterwards, which were this sort of flashpoint that could potentially drag the U.S. into a conflict following, obviously, a period where the U.S. was already having its hands full in the 60s, with Vietnam, and it wasn't even too long ago that World War II and the Korean War were fought, which are something that I think should be contextualized and kept in mind, which we can talk about in other segments. But Chiang Kai-shek actually has a grandson, of sorts, a great-grandson actually, Chiang Wan-an, who just became the newly elected mayor of Taipei. And I actually just learned that in Taipei, there's actually a new Taipei city, and then there's Taipei City. There's like these administrative divisions here that I'm sure if you're from Taiwan, you'd understand. But for someone like me who's American, looking at this abroad, that was something I learned. Hey, you learn something new every day, even someone like myself. We're always learning. And that's good. It's good. That's the whole point of the podcast. But I just wanted to mention that just to show you that, like Chiang Kai-shek and John F. Kennedy, they both have distant descendants. I mean, in the case of RFK Jr., that is, he's the nephew of John F. Kennedy, and as well as Chiang Wan-an, who is the great grandson, reportedly, as he is technically from an illegitimate side of Ching Kuo's family, but nonetheless is of the blood of Chiang Kai-shek and is a member of the Kuomintang and is a rising star in his own right in domestic politics in Taiwan, and maybe in the future will be in his own right a potential contender for the presidency of the Republic of China, which de facto is the government of Taiwan and its surrounding areas. We'll have to wait and see, but I only mentioned that as a sort of, build up to this article that I'm now about to read to show you how interconnected and how very much so the time that we're living in today is deeply, related and intertwined with what happened in the past and what is going to happen in the future. And we have to understand these things because so many people think these things can be isolated or picked apart or looked at in a vacuum. And I'm someone who really, as I just, discussed, don't believe that you can do that and come out of that understanding what's happening. So just, that's something to keep note of, and we'll get, more into my broader perspectives on history, politics, and the like in the future. But for now, let's actually dive into the article before I bore you guys any further.
Quote, "There are bigger issues at stake," end quote. The administration of John F. Kennedy and United States Republic of China relations, 1961 to 1963, by Charles J. Pellegrin. The administration of President John F. Kennedy, 1961 to 1963, focused considerable attention to foreign policy matters, most notably to Cold War disputes over Cuba and Berlin with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, better known as the USSR. In the meantime, the White House also faced crises with its anti-communist allies, particularly with the Republic of China, or the ROC, on the island of Taiwan, just off the coast of mainland China. Relations between the United States and the ROC caught the attention of several of Kennedy's advisors, some of whom suggested that the Eisenhower-Dulles policy of containment and isolation of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, should be reconsidered. Much has been written on American Cold War policy toward China. While Nancy Berkhoff Tucker's research on U.S.-Taiwan relations remains the standard, works by Noam Kochavi and John Garver have provided fresh insights on this unique alliance. Nonetheless, the most recent works on American-Chinese relations have emphasized the adversarial relationship between the United States and the PRC, and little focus has been cast on the collision of allied interest and bureaucratic quote-unquote turf battles over policy. These turf battles, though, are not new to Kennedy scholars. For example, political scientist Graham Allison, in his classic work entitled Essence of Decision, explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1971, hinted in his bureaucratic politics model that the Kennedy administration's handling of this October 1962 predicament may have reflected a collision of interest between individuals and organizations within the executive branch. Likewise, the American-Taiwanese relationship between 1961 and 1963 shows numerous examples of such collision of interest, which led to an ideological struggle over policy. By the end of Kennedy's presidency, Disagreement within the administration led some American policymakers to become increasingly frustrated with Chiang and caused them to more openly reconsider the larger scope of China policy, even to the point of discussing a more flexible and accommodationist approach to East Asia. But on the surface, Chiang Kai-shek, president of the Republic of China on Taiwan, may have had much to look forward to going into the 1960s. During the previous decade, Chiang had been a strong supporter of American policy in East Asia. After the Korean War, the ROC received copious amounts of military aid and became an American client state. Chiang had hoped that this aid and support would continue through the new Kennedy administration. Having won the 1960 presidential election by an extremely slim margin, the new president could not politically advocate major changes in China policy. Meanwhile, Kennedy had appointed a number of advisors who would suggest that the United States should rethink its China policy. Among the first of these appointments was Robert W. Comer, whom Kennedy appointed to the National Security Council staff early in 1961. A former agent of the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, Comer recommended to National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy that the State Department reconsider its Chinese relationships. Comer suggested that the United States, quote, disengage as skillfully as we can from the unproductive aspects of our China policy, e.g., UN membership. In his report titled, quote, Strategic Framework for Rethinking China Policy, end quote, Comer did not accept the idea that American position in the Far East hinged on Taiwan. Chiang, however, could not be allowed to lose power. Comer, therefore, proposed that the policy toward the ROC allow for greater flexibility. The Kennedy administration had to convince Chiang that the U.S. would continue to defend Taiwan and to maintain its international presence in the UN. Such a program would be expensive, but in the end, the quote, sole determinant of our FE or Far Eastern policy cannot be keeping Chiang happy or even of preserving Taiwan. There are bigger issues at stake, end quote. Kennedy also appointed a group of foreign policy experts and scholars, including Adlai E. Stevenson III, W. Averell Harriman, and Chester Bowles, each of whom had been vocal critics of Eisenhower's containment and isolation of the PRC. They all shared the idea that the United States should work toward a policy of accommodation with the PRC. The appointment of Dean Rusk as Secretary of State was also a major factor in the development of U.S. ROC relations during the Kennedy administration. In May 1961, Rusk met privately with President Kennedy to explore possible changes in China policy and to discuss the ramifications. Rusk stated that the United States could recognize both the PRC and the ROC, work privately to bring reconciliation between the two Chinas, or sit tight and do nothing. Kennedy, though, refused to initiate changes in China policy. Any changes in China policy, Kennedy warned, would divide Congress and the American people, and would hand the Republicans a political weapon to use in 1964. Rusk agreed with Kennedy, and as the secretary left the Oval Office, Kennedy further warned Rusk, quote, and what's more, Mr. Secretary, I don't want to read in the Washington Post or the New York Times that the State Department is thinking about a change in our China policy, end quote. Rusk publicly submerged his views with Kennedy's and did not directly initiate any new studies of China policy. Privately, though, Rusk contended that only by default was the ROC government the, quote, only Chinese government we, the United States, recognized, end quote. Meanwhile, the Kennedy administration inherited a foreign policy apparatus that did not encourage innovation. The State Department, especially the Bureau of Far Eastern Affairs, had been emptied of experts after investigations by Senator Joseph McCarthy targeted suspected communists. By 1961, the Bureau had been staffed with stern anti-communists who favored containment and isolation of the PRC. Later that year, Kennedy assigned Harriman as an Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, who then appointed Edward Rice to the Bureau from his position on the Policy Planning Council. Rice, a long-serving State Department analyst who had survived the McCarthy witch hunt, had long championed abandoning containment policy towards the PRC in favor of accommodation. While in the Policy Planning Council, Rice authored a paper that included a list of possible U.S. initiatives towards the Beijing regime, such as lifting the passport ban, opening arms control and disarmament talks, possible PRC representation in the United Nations, and ROC evacuation of offshore islands. In short, Rice's paper proposed a policy that was flexible, moderate, and accommodating towards the Communist Chinese. Apparently, he greatly influenced several young staffers at the Far Eastern Office, such as James C. Thompson Jr. and Roger Hilsman, to likewise advocate a more relaxed policy towards the PRC. Like Comer and Rice, Under-Secretary of State Chester Bowles also questioned the direction of China policy. In July 1961, he circulated a confidential report entitled, quote, "Some Requirements of American Foreign Policy," end quote, recommending various changes in American policy towards Europe, Africa, and Asia, but most significantly argued that both the PRC and ROC threatened regional stability. Attributing its aggression to the famine and government's failure to meet food requirements, Bowles claimed that the PRC was a regional threat that had to be excluded from the United Nations. But he argued nationalist China represented just as much of a problem in East Asia as the PRC. If the United States disengaged from Taiwan, the situation in Taipei may become chaotic and difficult to control. Instability could cause a war between the ROC and the PRC, or a coup d'etat that could result in Chiang's overthrow, or an attempt to turn Taiwan over to the Communist Chinese. Any future China policy, Bowles concluded, would have to consider and balance these mutually explosive situations. While some of Kennedy's State Department and White House appointees privately considered a more accommodationist China policy, Eisenhower administration stalwarts like Everett F. Drumright and Ray Klein opposed any such changes. A career diplomat, Drumright had been associated with the nationalist Chinese government in various capacities between 1931 and 1946, and then returned to the Foreign Service in the Office of Chinese Affairs when Eisenhower became president in 1953. He firmly believed that the security of nationalist China was vitally important to the United States. His hardline anti-communist opinions concerning China policy angered many of his colleagues in the Taipei embassy. Ray Klein similarly opposed significant changes in China policy. Since the Eisenhower administration, Klein had been CIA station chief in Taipei. Taking advantage of his position, Klein had become close friends with General Chiang Ching-kuo, President Chiang's son and Deputy Secretary General of the ROC's National Defense Council. Klein regularly conveyed Chiang's personal messages to the State Department and the White House. Chiang, Klein believed, feared the Democrats and contended that, quote, the faintest indication of a change in U.S. attitudes could seem like a matter of life and death, end quote. One of the first China policy crises the Kennedy administration faced concerned irregular ROC forces which had been operating in the Burma-Thailand-Laos border region since the 1950s. In 1949, 11,000 to 15,000 Chinese nationalist troops had fled China into this border region as the nationalist government and most of the military retreated to the island of Taiwan. By 1961, despite two previous attempts to evacuate these irregular soldiers, some 10,000, including women and children, remained. While the Burmese government demanded that these irregulars be evacuated, Chiang continued to supply these troops. In February 1961, the Burmese shot down two ROC aircraft, a B-24 supply plane bound for northern Burma and a PB-4Y, supplied to the nationalists through the U.S. Military Assistance Program, or MAP, the MAP. The Burmese government justified their actions on the ground that irregular troops, armed with American equipment supplied through such airdrops, had instigated trouble within their borders. Understanding Burma's problem, President Kennedy wanted these irregular troops to be withdrawn from Burma to Taiwan or broken into small groups for resettlement in Thailand and Laos. Chiang, during a February 25, 1961 meeting with Drumright, denied harming American interest. When asked to evacuate the irregulars, Chiang stated that while doing so would be met with great resistance because of their deep hatred for the Chinese communists, he also did recognize the inconvenience and embarrassment the situation caused to the United States. Chiang promised to end the airdrops and to evacuate those irregulars who wanted to be evacuated. In the case of those irregulars who are not longer responsive, or no longer, actually there was a typo in this paper, but it's still a good one, I digress, is not longer responsive to his orders, the ROC president promised to disassociate himself from them and terminate their resupply. Meanwhile, Secretary Rusk requested that Baghdad, the Bureau of Far Eastern Affairs, write a report on these ROC irregulars for President Kennedy. The report concluded that since the 1950s, President Chiang had disregarded American requests to evacuate his irregular troops from Burma. The irregulars, moreover, threatened the eternal stability of Thailand, Burma, and Laos, and their positions, along with the border of mainland China, jeopardized peace in the region. Some who were also suspected of trafficking in narcotics. The report thus concluded that the irregulars had to be evacuated or dispersed. Fearing that President Chiang would not cooperate, again my bad, voluntarily, the report suggested that Chiang could be manipulated by selectively limiting or ceasing military aid, refusing to train Taiwanese military special forces, and not participate in planning operations against the mainland. Some evidence suggests that Chiang feared such repercussions and ordered ROC irregular troops to disarm and return to Taiwan or settle as civilians. Nationalist Chinese General Lai Ming-tang, after meeting with Ambassador Drumright in April 1961, reported that some of the 600 to 700 irregulars living in the Burma-Laos-Thailand border and nearly 1,000 living in Thailand, quote, appeared to have gone into civilian life, end quote. Drumright, therefore, believed that the ROC had honestly and diligently carried out the American request. By the end of the month, he regarded the evacuation as complete. As the crisis over the ROC irregulars dissipated, the Kennedy administration faced a growing problem in the United Nations concerning ROC membership. Through the 1950s, there had been little challenge to Taiwan's status in the United Nations, but opposition increased in the 1960s. President Kennedy publicly pledged his support to maintain ROC membership in the UN and to keep the PRC out. Meanwhile, support for Taiwan slowly eroded as newly independent nations from Africa, some of whom were sympathetic to the PRC, joined the United Nations. Given this development, several of Kennedy's foreign policy staff believed it was necessary to derive new ideas and tactics to ensure the ROC's continued presence in the United Nations. In July 1961, Roger Hilsman of the State Department's Office of Intelligence and Research addressed the Chinese representation issue. It was important, according to Hilsman, for the United States to firmly establish the ROC's claim on the China seat. Hilsman concluded that the most prudent course Kennedy could take was to set up a commission to investigate the situation and provide further advice to the president. If the United States lost control over the issue, Hilsman wrote, quote, then doubts and tensions over United States relations to the United Nations would probably increase in the public attitude and the legislative attitude, end quote. On the other hand, Drumright and Klein argued that President Kennedy should take a more active stance. Ambassador Drumright expressed his concern that ROC officials feared that the Kennedy administration was looking for a convenient way out of the Chinese representation issue at the ROC's expense. Klein, though, worried that Taiwanese officials might not accept changes in American policy towards the ROC. Being that the nationalists might lose the debate on their UN seat, Klein warned that Chiang would not in the future trust this new Democratic administration in Washington and would move forward on an independent policy of invading the mainland. Hilsman, Drumright, and Klein each contended that the Taiwanese government officials had to be convinced that the Kennedy administration would continue to protect Taiwan's interests. On the other hand, the Kennedy administration could not allow the ROC to take action to guarantee their interest independently of the United States. President Kennedy echoed these sentiments during a July 1961 White House meeting concerning Chinese representation. The United States and the ROC, Kennedy stated, should have one common objective: to keep the PRC out of the United Nations. Meanwhile, the Chinese representation issue became more complicated when Soviet-dominated government of Outer Mongolia became independent and applied for admission in the UN. The ROC insisted that Outer Mongolia was a part of China and could not be admitted. Kennedy feared that an ROC veto over Outer Mongolia's membership could warrant a communist bloc push for Taiwan's ouster from the UN. Taiwan, contended Kennedy, should not veto Outer Mongolia's application into the UN. At the end of July 1961, Rusk proposed a parliamentary ploy that would ensure the ROC its continued membership and would exclude the PRC from the United Nations. Rusk suggested that a representative group of UN members develop a majority proposing that the Chinese representation issue was, quote, an important question, end quote, which required a two-thirds vote. This would hopefully delay any credentials vote regarding ROC membership. Or I think that what they meant to say, this is actually the paper, PRC membership. There was quite a few errors in it, but overall, when it comes to the grammar punctuation, the substance is very apt still nonetheless, and I will be linked in the description below as I mentioned before. So let me finish it off though. Kennedy and Rusk had to convince the ROC not to veto Outer Mongolia's application, a go along with the, quote, important question proposal, end quote. But the Taiwanese had already begun to take steps to ensure their seat in the UN through an African aid program called Operation Vanguard. This aid program had the ulterior motive of securing future support from newly independent African nations for Taiwan's China seat in the UN. Meanwhile, the African nation of Mauritania petitioned to enter the UN. A Soviet veto of Mauritania's UN membership would threaten both Taiwan's aid program and its ability to secure future support among newly independent African countries to maintain its China seat. Kennedy tried to convince Chiang not to become too involved in the UN representation issue. On August 15, 1961, Kennedy warned Chiang that he might not be able to rally majority support for continued ROC representation in the UN if the ROC vetoed Outer Mongolia's application. If the ROC lost its seat, Kennedy warned that the United States would not be able to generate support for military action to defend Taiwan if the mainland regime chose to attack. Chiang responded that Outer Mongolia's application for UN membership was nothing more than Soviet blackmail, and that the United States and their allies should reject it and earn the goodwill of African states supporting the ROC's and Mauritania's membership. Chiang essentially refused to change his plans to veto Outer Mongolia's application. Having made little headway to compromise with the ROC, Secretary of State Rusk instructed Ambassador Stevenson to move on the, quote, important question, quote, tactic. Rusk also sent instructions to the American embassy in Taipei that, if Chiang planned to, quote, go down with the ship rather than compromise on Outer Mongolia, the United States would share no responsibility for Chiang's decision, end quote. Rusk then urged Drumright to assure ROC officials that, because of their common interests, the United States would provide them the strongest support possible, but also reminded Drumright of the gravity of the situation, commenting that, quote, if we cannot persuade GRC to meet us on any of several significant matters, whom can we persuade, end quote. But by October, President Kennedy and Chiang reached an understanding. The United States would vote for Outer Mongolia's admission, oppose Communist China's entry into the United Nations, and President Kennedy would reassure Chiang that his government had the right to represent China in the UN. Meanwhile, Kennedy would privately assure Chiang that a U.S. veto would be used to prevent PRC entry if necessary. Finally, the ROC would not veto Outer Mongolia's application to join the United Nations. On December 15, 1961, quote, the important question, end quote, resolution passed the General Assembly 61 to 34 with several abstentions. While the United Nations representation issue was temporarily resolved, American policymakers became increasingly preoccupied with Chiang's oft-repeated statements and schemes to, quote, retake the mainland, end quote. Chiang insisted on a mainland return policy because his nationalist government could not abandon its raison d'etre. Chiang's moment of opportunity to attack and retake the mainland seemed to arise in the early 1960s as the mainland suffered through one of the worst famines in recorded history. While the famine caused the deaths of between 40 to 80 million people, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev recalled 1,400 scientists and engineers in April 1960, which led to reductions in industrial production, disruptions in the national transportation system, and transfer of workers to famine-affected areas. Chiang's intention towards the mainland generated much concern and discussion in Washington, and many in the White House and State Department believed that he had to be reined in. Meanwhile, the growing conflict in Vietnam threatened to complicate U.S.-ROC military relations. Chiang hoped to use the deteriorating situation in Vietnam as a means to become more involved in Southeast Asia and in the long run as another front in his civil war against Mao and the mainland communist regime. Differing views within the Kennedy administration added to the complications. While Defense Department officials sought to use the ROC in the ever-widening crisis in South Vietnam, high-ranking State Department policymakers hoped to thwart Chiang's desires. William P. Bundy, Assistant Secretary of Defense, wrote that South Vietnamese President Nhu Dinh Diem wished to use Chinese nationalist troops, naturalize them as Vietnamese citizens, and utilize them in the Mekong River Delta, where there was already a large number of ethnic Chinese. U. Alexis Johnson, Deputy Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, warned that the presence of nationalist Chinese troops on the Asian mainland would open a, quote, Pandora's box, drawing Chinese communist intervention and exacerbating anti-Chinese prejudice in the region. In February 1962, Chiang pressed Klein and Bundy that the United States and Taiwan, in a joint effort, should take immediate action to rescue the mainland from the communists. Later, Ambassador Drumright met with Chiang and urged him to take into consideration world opinion and American responsibilities, because the Americans would be more cautious about opening a new front in the Cold War. Drumright then warned the State Department that Chiang was determined to order a mainland invasion that year. To prevent a war, the United States had to channel Chiang's actions, quote, in directions we deem appropriate, end quote. Roger Hilsman also became quite nervous about a Chinese mainland invasion after his March 1962 meeting with Defense Minister Chiang Ching-kuo, who proposed that the United States provide to Taiwan airplanes to drop several 200-man teams of paratroopers. Hilsman compared the defense minister's proposal with earlier problems in Cuba, noting that the mainland Chinese were discontented, but would not risk their lives unless they were very sure of success. Despite such hesitations, Kennedy proposed to send American aircraft to Taiwan in March 1962, but refused to participate directly in Chiang's plans. He suggested that the United States send to Taiwan 2 C-123 or C-123 aircrafts to be flown by Chinese crews trained in the United States. The C-123s could be used to haul cargo and as many as 61 fully equipped troops. Kennedy then asked Ray Klein to persuade ROC government officials to drop public discussions of plans to invade the mainland and make clear to Chiang, quote, that no commitment was being made other than to prepare the planes and be willing to consider their use, end quote. Throughout early April 1962, Klein met regularly with President Chiang and Defense Minister Chiang Ching-kuo. In those meetings, Klein convinced the Chiangs to postpone the target date for an initial airdrop from June until October 1st, 1962. But President Chiang wanted Kennedy's reassurances that he would fully support the ROC's plans, especially regarding the drop date and mutual study of plans for military operations. Upon hearing Chiang's position, McGeorge Bundy warned Klein that the American position, quote, must be that it stands on what is outlined. We cannot safely get ourselves in the position of negotiating this, end quote. Klein, delivering Chiang's response to President Kennedy's position, stated that Chiang was willing to take sole responsibility for any attack and that Taiwan was, quote, obliged to take certain prudent military preparedness measures to be ready to intervene in case the situation deteriorates to the point where the U.S. agrees that actions is in the free world's interest, end quote. In May 1962, as tensions mounted between the United States and Taiwan over Chiang's preparations to attack the mainland. President Kennedy appointed longtime family friend Admiral Alan G. Kirk, U.S. Navy general retired at the time, as the new ambassador to the ROC. After meeting with President Chiang in July 1962, Ambassador Kirk questioned whether the United States should provide bombers and landing craft to the ROC, or whether granting them to Chiang's government would display American trust in the ROC and indicate U.S. desire to help Chiang recover the mainland. Kirk stated that the American response to the ROC request for such weapons was being taken by the ROC officials as an indication of unwillingness to help. Nonetheless, Kirk advised the State Department to delay such deliveries because the types of materials requested were obviously of an offensive nature, and, quote, its release to the ROC cannot be concealed, end quote. He then, therefore, proposed that the United States provide Chiang materials on the condition that U.S. policymakers oversee Taiwanese military planning. This minimal aid would allow the Kennedy administration to back away from the previously approved 200-man drops because of the limited capacity of the C-123s. Harriman agreed with Kirk's proposal, which essentially assured that Chiang Kai-shek would not be able to launch an assault against Communist China without a large number of paratroopers. In September, Kirk informed Chiang that the United States would send 2 C-123s to Taiwan when they were ready and the crews trained, but that President Kennedy refused to provide Chiang with the bombers and landing craft. Chiang then warned Kirk that if the Kennedy administration prevented the ROC from going ahead with these airdrop plans, he would have great difficulty maintaining his and the ROC's military confidence. The efforts of Kirk, Harriman, and others seemed to pay dividends. By the beginning of October, American officials in Taiwan noted a decrease in invasion rhetoric coming from the Taiwanese government and press. There were also no new reports of, quote, forced draft activities, which indicated that military training was returning to normal. Nonetheless, the ROC continued to launch small-scale intelligence gathering operations using fishing boats as, quote, motherships to land infiltration teams on the mainland. Thomas L. Hughes of the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research grew concerned that these missions would result in a drawing of the United States further into ROC plans for a full-scale invasion. Hughes concluded that the ROC would seek greater amounts of American equipment and aircraft for larger operations, perhaps with a view to land one or more 200-man teams on the mainland. Later in February, Ambassador Kirk observed that Chiang and other ROC officials were exhibiting symptoms of, quote, spring fever. Building land craft, training soldiers in a new airborne division, and publicly stating that the time to retake the mainland, quote, was ripe now or never, end quote. In March, Kirk questioned whether or not, quote, the retention of the island of Taiwan in friendly hands is vital to the interest of the United States, end quote. Although President Kennedy continued to make public statements of support for Chiang through the spring of 1963, he and his advisors began privately to reconsider the necessity of providing military assistance to the ROC. In the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Sino-Soviet rift, the establishment of a Washington-Moscow, quote, hotline, end quote, and the signing of the Test Ban Treaty of July 1963, the worldwide diplomatic climate had shifted from potential warfare between the superpowers to their mutual impetus to negotiate. Perhaps neither Kennedy nor his advisors were willing to chance the diplomatic gains of peace made with the Soviets by the summer of 1963, and were thus, by extension, no longer willing to publicly support Chiang's plans to invade mainland China. On September 11, 1963, President Kennedy met with ROC Defense Minister Chiang Ching-kuo in the White House. Chiang, on behalf of his father, insisted that the United States and the ROC take advantage of the situation on the mainland and requested 5 C-130 aircraft in addition to the C-123s requested earlier, and landing craft as well to conduct raids along the mainland coast, with the goals of creating disruption and seizing one or more provinces, quote, south of the Yangtze River when the time was ripe, end quote. Kennedy responded that American policy, quote, should be determined by reality and not by the hopes or optimism, end quote, and that the United States, quote, did not wish to become involved in military operations where our role would inevitably become known and which would end in failure, end quote. While the Kennedy administration attempted to prevent the crisis in the Taiwan Strait from becoming an all-out war between the PRC and the ROC, State Department staffers in the Policy Planning Council initiated a plan to moderate the American policy toward the communist world, including the PRC. Walt W. Rostow, the newly appointed director of the State Department's Policy Planning Council, authored this report, quote, the Basic National Security Policy, end quote, which suggested that the United States and the Soviet Union could negotiate agreements over areas of mutual interest. The Soviet Union would not, quote, deliberately take actions which would bring about a general nuclear war, end quote, a war that no one could win. Hence, this idea, this is a side note, of mutually ensured destruction. That's a brief note back to the rest of this article. So, Rostow also hoped that this threat of mutual destruction from a nuclear war would modify U.S. relations with Communist China, suggesting that the United States, quote, leave ajar possibilities for expanding commercial, cultural, and other contacts with Communist China, end quote. But while the United States worked towards normalization of relations with the PRC, Rostow stated that the United States should continue to work with the ROC. The United States should, quote, make plans our enduring commitment to sustain and defend a free government on Taiwan, end quote. Therefore, the United States should use its leverage to encourage Taiwan either to, quote, withdraw its forces from the offshore islands or to regard the islands as outposts to be garrisoned. If and when this can be done without damage to our position in the Far East, end quote. Although Rostow did not specifically call for a, quote, two-China policy, the report very clearly stated that the United States should maintain relations with both the PRC and the ROC. Understandably, Rostow's initiative provoked grave concern in the ROC. When Qing Fu Xing, ROC ambassador to the United States, met with Dean Rusk in early July 1962 to discuss the Chinese Communist military buildup, he noted that opinion in Taiwan had become alarmed by Rostow's report. This would inevitably mean, according to Xing, U.S. recognition of the PRC's admittance to the UN, and American neutralization of Taiwan. All of this was deemed as unacceptable from the vantage point of Taipei. Rusk replied that he hoped the report would not be misleading or confusing and he would consider Qing's concerns, but he reassured him that, quote, he did not want to give the impression, however, that there would be any major changes in our publicly stated position, end quote. Rostow's initiative never received a groundswell of support, nor did it immediately result in a change in China policy. Nonetheless, the report remains significant for several reasons. Although the Kennedy administration never formally approved the report, quote, the Basic National Security Policy, end quote, it acknowledged a shift in thinking at some levels in the State Department. Possible changes in China policy included a more accommodating relationship with the PRC, or at least being discussed now within the State Department bureaucracy, as opposed to before. This report did not bode well for the ROC, which claimed to be the government of all of China and continued to label the Beijing regime as illegitimate. Nonetheless, this report would influence future public statements of foreign policy with the communist world and might have influenced other State Department staffers to further challenge the established policies of containment and isolation of the PRC. Bureaucratic changes in the Bureau of Far Eastern Affairs further contributed to the elevation of mainland Chinese affairs on its agenda. Until 1962, a single China desk had handled affairs concerning both the Taipei and Beijing regimes, respectively. To bring mainland Chinese affairs to the forefront, the Bureau in mid-1962 established two separate desks, which included a mainland China affairs desk and a Republic of China affairs desk. This arrangement opened the door for the consideration of a new policy idea
toward the PRC and allowed them to filter higher up to the State Department's bureaucracy. By late 1963, particularly in November, the new mainland China desk had been renamed the Office of Asian Communist Affairs and separated from the Office of East Asian Affairs, which handled matters concerning Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. The Office of Asian Communist Affairs could now freely access and influence policymaking. Within the new Office of Asian Communist Affairs, staffers now had a degree of freedom to explore new opportunities towards the PRC without running afoul of the more staunchly anti-communist China hands in the Office of East Asian Affairs. These organizational changes soon began to bear fruit. The Kennedy administration had initially considered Communist China as an expansionist state that threatened regional security in East Asia and had to be contained. A small group of State Department staffers, including Roger Hilsman, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, James C. Thompson Jr., Special Assistant in the Bureau of Far Eastern Affairs, Lindsey Grant of Mainland China Affairs, and Alan S. Whiting, Director of the Office of Research for Far Eastern Affairs, contended that it was a time now to propose more realistic China policy. Believing that the remnants of the, quote, China bloc and the, quote, China lobby would not mount much of a counterattack, and then they wrote a speech that outlined a policy of, quote, firmness, flexibility, and dispassion, end quote, towards Communist China. The U.S. would firmly support its allies, in particular the Republic of China, in their determination to halt aggression. But the U.S. would also be willing to negotiate with the Communist Chinese and dispassionately discuss and analyze mutual problems and seek solutions in their common interest. Once completed, the speech was sent to the White House and the senior officials at the State Department for approval. Notably, the speech cleared the White House and the State Department without having to have been read by newly elected due to the events with the Kennedy administration, which I got into a little bit before and we'll talk about more after in my analysis, but now President, or I guess he succeeded as he was the Vice President due to Kennedy's famous assassination in Dallas, Texas in the 1960s, 1963 I believe to be precise, but yes, President Lyndon B. Johnson, to end that side note, and then his Assistant Secretary of State, Harriman, or Secretary Russ, who they both refused to go over the speech despite Hilsman's request. Roger Hilsman delivered the televised speech at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, California, on December 13, 1963. Hilsman stated that, in the past, quote, emotionalism and, quote, misapprehension of reality had guided American policy toward China. Instead, Hilsman echoed Rostow's suggestions in the, quote, Basic National Security Policy memo and called for a China policy that sought to, quote, keep the door open to the possibility of change and not to slam it shut against any developments which might advance out of national good, serve the free world, and benefit the people of China, end quote. He believed that the Chinese communists, like the Soviets, might be amenable towards reaching, quote, limited agreements which could bring some reduction of, quote, any danger between the United States and the PRC. Hilsman's speech was the first public statement by a high-ranking State Department official suggesting that the United States wished to reach an accommodation with the PRC if the PRC modified its hostility towards the United States. This did not mean, however, that the United States would abandon the ROC. Hilsman stated that the U.S. would continue to block communist Chinese attempts to, quote, commit aggression on its free world neighbors, end quote. By the end of 1963, American officials had grown increasingly frustrated with Chiang Kai-shek and the status of China policy. Although President Kennedy did not publicly advocate change, his appointees and their reorganization of the State Department bureaucracy brought forth new approaches towards the PRC and the ROC. But as it seemed more certain that Chiang intended to be more aggressive towards the mainland than the United States wished, some policymakers became more vocal in favoring a more flexible China policy. Their writings would influence East Asian policy through the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, as the United States increasingly became involved in Vietnam and steadily reconsidered policy towards the PRC as a consequence. In the wake of improving relations with the Soviet Union and deteriorating conditions in East Asia, there were,
certainly bigger issues at stake. And that is it for this particular article, at least insofar as I'm reading from it. If you're interested in checking it out for yourself and rereading it again, go and give it a look after this segment. It will be included in the description below, linked. Thank you in advance. And I do encourage you all to do your own research and to check things out. Don't just take my word for anything. And obviously continue to learn and experience things so that you can make yourself the best version that you can possibly be. But with that sorts of, advice as vague as it is, because I don't try to give specific life advice aside, I want to get into the nitty gritty of this, because anyone can read an article or summarize it. But in this particular segment, I wanted to provide some critical analysis and try to draw parallels between the 1960s and the situation, both when it comes to domestic American politics and also foreign policy as the U.S. would conduct itself abroad in terms of the ongoing Cold War at that time, and seeing where there's convergences as well as differences in terms of the situation as it is developing in our own contemporary period in the 2020s, as we're seeing that there now, according to many observers and experts, and even some laymen alike, such as myself, that there are potentially reasons to believe that we're in a sort of second Cold War, if not the period that I came of age and grew up in the 1990s to 2020-ish, was this period where it was maybe historians will consider an interregnum, where it was sort of a brief pause between a elongated and contiguous Cold War conflict, and maybe there was a brief period, as I just said, where it seemed to cool off, but now it's definitely heating up again. If it's heating up during a Cold War, does that make any sense? I guess it could turn to a hot war, but I know in this case we're discussing it solely within its dimensions as a sort of situation like you saw in the 20th century, with the Soviet Union having the Warsaw Pact and the United States having NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the latter of which was victorious in this conflict at the time. And you also had the PRC, as you will today, as well as the ROC, only at that time recently having relocated to Taiwan. And as I discussed with the Taiwan question more broadly in this segment, there is a lot of overlap but differences in terms of the current situation today, as in contrast to back then when it was under a one-party Deng Guo political tutelage or sort of dictatorship that Sun Yat-sen had said was necessary before a transition to democracy, where he sort of looked at the model of the Bolsheviks and Lenin and applied it in sort of, at least when it comes to the broader principles, not the economic ones, but the sort of structures of the political institutions of the Kuomintang at the time, when it was the central government of China, at least in the areas they controlled, which, following with Sun, you had his successor, whom I discussed in this segment primarily, Chiang Kai-shek, who led the Northern Expedition, ended the warlord period, ended the Beiyang government, which had formerly been the recognized international government, and then had, for a time between the 1920s to 1949, had, with a brief period in the 1940s where they had to retreat to Chongqing, had a government that was the internationally recognized and official government of China, mainly based in Nanjing, which was the capital, and still is de jure the capital of the ROC, but de facto it is Taipei ever since they had to relocate in 1949 following Chiang's loss in the civil war against Mao, which I've talked about in previous segments if you want to tune into that sort of thing. It's an entire segment in itself, and we can get back into it, but it is worth mentioning, especially considering that if it had not been for other interrelated events going on a little bit farther afield, but still in the general region of East Asia, especially with the Korean conflict and the Vietnamese conflict, which were things that were going to happen soon, as well as just the sort of post-World War II reshuffling of the balance of power. I mean, we're in a similar sort of transition period. There's differences, of course, now where we're seeing this sort of increasing crisis within the multilateral institutions such as the United Nations of how they're going to be structured going forward. You have countries that had previously either destroyed or relatively just decolonized or made independent or sovereign entities, such as in between. I would say there's a number of them now. I mean, there's India, there's obviously China, there's Turkey, there's some others too that we could talk about in other segments that had now increasingly wanted to assert their own presence abroad and globally, and are challenging
the 5 permanent member seats at the Security Council, and the entire post-World War II sort of Bretton Woods settlement, which has allowed the U.S., my home country here, to be the predominant superpower, or only superpower, and predominant great power the world over. But we can talk about all that stuff in another segment. I only point it all out because this is happening closely around the same time as, actually right after this article that I read, and it's important to note these things as there were so many different interrelated disputes, and including with Korea, the fact that the ROC's vote as it maintained the seat for China in the UN, which caused the Soviets to boycott it, along with the US and every other member besides the Soviets who were not there. And they learned, obviously, not to boycott events, so when they did that, they were trying to virtue signal, but ultimately lost influence, which they could have potentially used to fundamentally alter the conflict in Korea, as without the Soviets and with the Maoists not yet having won the China seat at the UN, which they would in 1971 later on after this article's occurrence, which was during the Kennedy era in the 60s, just a side note. But before that, the ROC would be able to use its position and its seat that it had gotten since 1945, being one of the original Big Five members of the Allied powers, along with the Soviets, the Americans, and the British, as well as the French, which, they were had to be saved themselves. China too, to a degree, but we can talk about all that in another segment. Maybe some will disagree by America. But when it comes to the situation after this war, when it came to all these things happening, it's easy with all the details and facts that I just outlined some to get lost in all of it. But I think to parse out specific instances and try to tie them into what we can understand as what's going on today, I think that is crucial and is something that I'm going to be trying to flesh out not only here but in other segments as well. Because arguably, especially with the case of Korea that I just mentioned, if it wasn't for the Korean War, potentially Chiang's position and his ability to consolidate on Taiwan might have not come to fruition, as Mao at the time, especially back then, I think that if China really didn't want to screw up, I think you can even make a similar argument with the situation with North Korea now that the U.S. is dealing with, that if they would have been able to somehow settle this sooner, it probably would have been better. Especially if they had to do this sort of invasion and it succeeded in the 50s, only recently with Chiang still in control of Taiwan, with the war still being not something that has been this sort of frozen conflict now for decades, ever since 1949. And there were brief periods in between, which I'll mention in a little bit. There were periods of shelling intermediate between 1949 and when the 1970s happened, where you had a sort of changing of the guard with the passing of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, and he also, Mao the latter, had, through the Cultural Revolution and some other things, he had also already begun to sort of take more of a backseat role, and then there were more successors from his generation, such as Deng Xiaoping, among others, who would take control of the helm of the now formed PRC, which at that time had then gained full recognition as the official government of China, and today that sort of is taken for granted, at least now. No one really takes the claims of the ROC Constitution to be anything other than symbolic, at least at the moment. But back then, I would even say potentially a restoration or an invasion by Chiang, a sort of counter-strike to retake the mainland from the quote-unquote communist forces or communist bandits that Chiang would always, or the Kuomintang would always refer to the Reds or the Maoists as, which then, at the time, not really anymore, considering that they are the official government. With that aside, though, I think that it's interesting to just see that at that time, things were far more malleable, and I think that there would have been more leeway for Beijing to, even though it was in maybe a more weaker state, to go all in and potentially escalate. You were already in this sort of conflict, and it only stopped in 1949 because the PLA was not able to further advance past the Matsu and Kinmen Islands, which the ROC government still retains to this day, along with the Pescadores, some islands in the South China Sea, including Taiping Island, which is one of the bigger islands near the Spratlys and the Parasols, I believe. And that can be talked about in another segment, but it's also interesting to note, especially considering what I talked about I read about in that article, that this idea of a reignition of the conflict at any moment, it happened in Korea on and off after the fact. In Vietnam, until the U.S. left, there was all sorts of guerrilla actions, famously with the Viet Cong and whatnot. But in the case of Taiwan, there was really, I think, a true sense of loss that Chiang had. I can talk about in another segment about him and his son had flew from the airport, I think, at, was it Chongqing? Or, I mean, I think it was, there was one other city that they fled from. I mean, they had fled originally from Nanjing before the entire country was taken, and had already been planning to relocate the institutions of the government as well as much assets as they could take, including much of the collection that is now at the National Palace Museum of Chinese artifacts, many of which were spared the destruction during the Cultural Revolution only because Chiang had, for either good or ill reasons, effectively looted them and taken them with him to Taiwan. I mean, he would claim that the ROC, and it was up until that time the official government, and that this was a legitimate action, but I'm not sure. I mean, I think I would just say, for the sake of, since I'm pro-Taiwan, sure, I guess, but I mean, on some level, maybe considering that the Chinese government now, for better and for worse, is the legitimate government, maybe that they can make a counterclaim, and depending on the outcome in the future, especially if America doesn't get its act together, maybe they will be able to assert the contrary claim. And I mean, who knows? I think that there's perspective from both sides that could be assessed and appreciated. But at any rate, when it comes to the situation where Chiang really was, I think, convinced, and he had this whole thing called Project for National Glory, where he intended, along with his son Chiang Ching-kuo, to, after consolidating their position in Taiwan and getting a Sino-American Defense Treaty in 1955, which even culminated with Eisenhower, who I mentioned before, being the first and only U.S. president to visit Taiwan, have a state visit, and be given all the pomp and splendor that the circumstance should afford between two allied countries, and especially that the U.S. and the ROC have been allies in World War II, which was mentioned during the speech that Eisenhower gave. That whole thing was something that even had the fun side note of Eisenhower claiming that he would resort to using potential nuclear weapons to defend Taiwan if the PRC were to try to retake it by force, which is something that to this day is something that is a concern, and is an increasing one with the contemporary players of the map, with Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan and her VP William Lai, who actually, there's an interesting, not to get off on too much of a tangent, concern that was similar to what Chiang, with a little bit inverse though, because William Lai is the vice president of the Taiwan at the moment, or the ROC, with the DPP, the Democratic People's Progressive Party, and he actually was, at least in his youth, a staunch independence activist, and had made comments about coming into the White House as an independently recognized country being the end goal of his political career. And that had caused plenty of concerns, because neither the US or China officially support a changing of the status quo. I mean, there's this one China policy, or one China principle that China has, and the U.S. has a one China policy where they acknowledge China's position but don't necessarily agree to it. And this is this idea that the ROC, the Republic of China on Taiwan, is sort of a country that's sort of stuck in limbo, where effectively the ROC has just become Taiwan and those outlying islands, but effectively, because it claims through its constitution to still be the legitimate government of all of China, and has been ever since. I mean, there was a lifting of the martial law, obviously, that was in place from 1949 to 1988 with the Chiang Kai-shek and his son, who actually, Chiang Ching-kuo, loosens much of the restrictions and then allowed for the gradual democratization following his passing. But with that aside, it's interesting to note that for a period, though, the DPP was not even allowed to exist, and much like with Chiang, with the Kuomintang advocating for and making a focal point of the propaganda on Taiwan and the justification for his legitimacy to remain as the president of the ROC, as, you know, this sort of bastion of quote-unquote free China at the time, or the free area of the Republic of China, claiming to be the whole government of the mainland. William Lai, on the reverse side, wants to basically create a Republic of Taiwan, or is in favor of the pan-green sort of efforts to make Taiwan, divorce it completely de facto and de jure from the ROC and make it its entirely own separate entity, which Beijing considers a red line, and has threatened that if that were to occur, that there would be this, you know, this would be something that would trigger them having to, with no choice, resort to the use of force to stop what they perceive as to be separatists attempting to break away what they consider as an integral part of their territory. And that's something that, I mean, it's not exactly the same, but with Chiang, he wanted to upset the status quo, not by declaring independence. He actually went after independence activists and would have never allowed a party like the DPP to exist when the Kuomintang had still maintained its Dang Guo system that was a holdover from the mainland from 1949. And it obviously loosened from afterwards when his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, took over. Prior to that, though, with the Generalissimo himself still being firmly at the helm of the ship of state, at least for the Republic of China as it existed on Taiwan at the time, from the period of the 40s and 50s up until the end of the 60s when the car crash that I briefly mentioned before, which I definitely need to get back to. It's a very interesting discussion and topic, considering that I think it definitely shortened Chiang Kai-shek's life expectancy significantly and might have even fundamentally altered the timetables. Maybe things would have happened at a slower pace as they already had in our timeline, but considering all the fascinating what ifs, it'll be definitely something I have to visit again. But with that prior thing not incorporated into our considerations, Chiang Kai-shek up until then was firmly, especially when he was in good health, hell-bent on realizing Project for National Glory and triumphantly returning in one way or another to mainland China and liberating the entirety of it and making Nanjing once again the capital city of China. Ultimately, however, as any of us who are observers and familiar with recent developments, especially not just in America but China and the world over, we know that that did not come to pass, and this so-called Project for National Glory was unfortunately little more than what ended up being a pipe dream. However, I don't want you to take this all for granted, as based off of what we had analyzed and discussed in the reading piece, it looked like there could have been multiple occasions where this could have turned out very differently. And that's very interesting to see the difference between the public and private sort of rhetoric that was coming out of Washington and the internal debate between policymakers over what kind of approach, whether to isolate the PRC or to try some sort of détente with them. And ultimately, under the Nixon administration, spearheaded by Henry Kissinger, who is still alive and recently turned 100 in May, belated happy birthday to him, I guess, for better and for worse. He is one of the defining statesmen of American policy after World War II, and the last who is still alive, maybe the last of such significance as him. And obviously he's a very polarizing, controversial figure too, deeply involved in the situation with Vietnam, and it was called Indochina, I think, still colloquially at the time. But that aside, we could talk about that in another segment. When it comes to the situation there, especially considering with Chiang, he even tried to figure out ways to get involved in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, offering to, at several points, try to use this sort of conflict here. And it's funny because now China, with this Taiwan situation, there's also fears of it dragging other regional countries like Japan, Korea, both Koreas, North and South Korea, having this be a sort of multi-ended multiple front conflict within the same broader region of East Asia. And back then, Chiang was in some ways vaguely doing an inverse of that. Instead of it being these countries like the North Korea, the DPRK, and the PRC, it was the ROC wanting to get involved to help prop up the ROK and the RVN and or ROV, the Republic of Vietnam at the time, which was, this just like now where we have this sort of newer Cold War conflict that we're still figuring out the precise ways to frame and understand it. Back then we had this sort of situation where Chiang was trying to find some sort of opening and be able to use that as the pretext to attack and retake the mainland. As much of the propaganda on Taiwan that was promoted by the ROC government led by the Kuomintang at the time, which is still one of the major parties, and I think is the oldest political party in Asia that's still operating. Correct me if I'm wrong, but clearly today they have changed much of their ideology and have had to moderate in the face of the localization efforts and the democratization process, which has had all sorts of consequences, which we could talk about, and definitely, especially when I just mentioned before William Lai, who is going to be running for president, among others, against the KMT, and I think there's other factions there also running. There's a third party too, potentially. I forget the name, sorry if you're in that party, but I'll talk about those in a little bit. They're important, but going to be in another segment, I think, for the sake of brevity. And I wanted to mention these only because, just like with Chiang having to ultimately not and unfortunately for him, not be able to fulfill his goal of going back to the mainland. I don't think William Lai either will be able to achieve the sort of goal that he wanted to go and visit the White House as the president of the Republic of Taiwan, or have Taiwan in any way be officially de jure its own independent entity, divorced from the ROC. If he is to become president, which isn't even guaranteed for sure yet, of the Republic of China and Taiwan, I actually think he will just maintain the policy of his predecessor, who is Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan at the moment, whom is obviously de facto the president of Taiwan, but de jure the president of the Republic of China. And she has a sort of public-private, I think, position and has maintained the status quo officially, which is something that has at least prevented a conflict from escalating that could clearly sort of be pinned on the fault of Taipei. And obviously to maintain the strategic relationship with Washington, among others, I think that William Lai will have to straddle and play this delicate balancing act himself, for better and for worse. But if you think about it, I think that the situation, as different as it is with the DPP, can be looked at and compared to that, as I just mentioned before, with Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang at the time, especially considering that in the situation with Kennedy and having to deal with, just like Biden being actually, it's ironic because Biden is the second Catholic president of the United States, and I think Kennedy was the first, and actually his election at the time, not only was Chiang, who was, I think, more the China lobby in America at the time, at least the China lobby when the ROC was China, was more sort of always in line with the Republican Party at that time. And their relationship, especially with presidents such as Harry Truman, was never really as cozy. I think they got along fine with FDR, but especially under Truman, I think that there was a huge falling out, which led to the U.S. cutting off most of its aid during a pivotal period between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China fighting each other in the 1940s. But that aside, with Kennedy, there was a similar fear that potentially he would, as I mentioned and read about in the article, potentially take a different path and diverge from maintaining the position that Chiang had considered as, at the time, necessary for his own survival and the preservation of the ROC on Taiwan. And that was something I think that was a valid concern, but I think also is something that was more minor if you think about the domestic skepticism that some had, especially the traditional WASP elite, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite in Washington, that, historically that was, up until Kennedy's election, the sort of default when it came to who you'd expect to be in the presidency. There were some people, I think, who were mixed Irish, but an Irish Catholic who wasn't a Protestant stock and not of the sort of, situation of being old money, like a Rockefeller or a Roosevelt or someone in that sort of vein. It's funny because Rockefeller actually, I think William Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller actually was a scion of that family, and he was a liberal sort of Republican from New York and the governor of a presidential contender, but he never got elected. And in terms of the Democratic Party, at least in this situation domestically, they were never seen as a more overtly pro-ROC or pro-Taiwan party, and they still aren't to this day, even though there is a bipartisan consensus to support Taipei, especially in the face of the increasing tensions between the Beijing and Washington over the Taiwan issue. But to get into the nitty-gritty here of what I think is actually something that has a lot of overlap, you see today this whole discussion potentially of the war, if it were to be reignited as a hot conflict, of it reigniting over what I mentioned before as the Kinmen and Matsu Islands. At the time, I think back then they were known as Quemoy, and I think those were the islands that are right across from Xiamen in China, and are technically a part of the ROC's Fujian province, and there's a PRC Fujian province, effectively making this Fujian region divided. It's not mainland. The contiguous territories of the mainland are all belong to the PRC, but these outlying islands, they're literally right across a short, stone's throw away. Those are de facto under the control of the Republic of China, which is, Taiwan in this case. But just like now that there's this fear with the proximity of these islands potentially being a spark or being used as a pretext to reignite a broader conflict in the region, in a similar vein, back then, during especially the 1960 presidential election, as I mentioned before, there was this sort of situation with JFK of him being
I mean, I think the closest comparison we have, at least in modern times, would be the election of Obama in terms of the level of charisma and the sort of national unity that this sort of person, I mean, encapsulated. Obviously, with Trump, he's more of a polarizing figure, for better and for worse. But when it comes to JFK, I think that he had his own sort of cult of personality that was a little, it's not as like the ones in these authoritarian countries. As I mentioned before in other segments, you think of a cult of personality, I think, in a negative sense, like a cult, but in a more value neutral sense, these things, depending on who is tapping into these energies and these social technologies, in lack of a better term, can ultimately determine how they manifest, and sometimes they manifest in better forms than others, and some in more horrendous than others, depending on the figure, the time, and the context. But when it comes to JFK, who really was, I think, a larger-than-life figure, and to this day is someone who's relevant in the zeitgeist of American politics, I think it's important to keep in mind that he actually had a similar debate with Nixon, actually, when it came to foreign policy in the 1960s election, over whether or not the United States should provide a security guarantee, or should their security guarantee underlined in the Sino-American Defense Pact, I think of 1955, as I mentioned before, if that also included under that umbrella not just Formosa or Taiwan, but those outlying islands. And Nixon was of the belief that those islands by default should be and could be used as a reason for the U.S. to get involved to defend them, as well as the Republic of China, the free area more broadly. And Kennedy took a more sort of, I'd say, approach where it was more cautious in terms of not committing to Taiwan, obviously, the Republic of China based in Taipei, but not those outlying islands, which he saw as being way too close for comfort to the PRC. And keep in mind that under Eisenhower's administration, whom Nixon was the vice president of, he actually had seen the ROC lose the remainder of what was Cheqing or Zhejiang province, the province that I think Chiang Kai-shek himself was from, in 1955, following the Battle of the Dachen Archipelago, which occurred, I think, around January 19th of 1955 and ended February 26th of that year, so just a little bit over a month. And those were over the Taichen Islands, which controlled a really strategic area that could have effectively, if Taiwan still controlled them, blocked China's waterway and access to those trade routes that it relies on to not only import but also export its wares across the world. And that was something that was one of those few areas, unlike Quemoy and Matsu, that were able to actually be taken by the PRC forces. They were able to land, and under the General Zhang Aping, they were able to take this island with a force of 28,000. Chiang Ching-kuo, actually, along with Alfred M. Pride, who was a admiral in the U.S. Navy at the time, coordinated an evacuation. And there was 15,000 soldiers, as well as, I think, a few thousand civilians whom were located on these islands, and they were all evacuated to Taiwan afterwards. But with the loss of these islands and the official abolition of the Cheqing province, it was very clear that these islands were not something, especially considering that the proximity between Matsu and Kinmen were even closer to mainland China, arguably. They were all relatively close, but these were, you could see to this day, Xiamen, the city, right across. I mean, if you're on either side, these areas are very close to each other, despite them being controlled by two separate governments. They're technically still at war and could potentially be again in the near future in some sort of hot conflict. It just goes to show the precarious state of these islands, and there was a real risk that these could have led to an escalation. And there's even debates that I think to this day that are still going on, as I mentioned, about whether these islands should be safeguarded or what should be the contingency for if those were to be attacked or used as some sort of opening strike in a broader conflict with the PRC. We'll have to see about that, but I think it was worth mentioning this because it shows how there were so many interconnecting parts and conflicting issues here. And if you're not overwhelmed as someone who might be a layman, I know for sure as someone like myself who does this more for a profession and also keeps up with these things vociferously, that it really does seem, at least when I first read all these things, to be a lot to first initially process. But it's all important, and I think that the fact that these islands, if you just open up Google Map, I'll link it below, the map, and you can see the distance between Kinmen and Xiamen itself, it really is something else. And the fact that it's right there, I mean,
this is the same amount of distance, basically, I mean, practically, of having Ukraine being bordered to Russia, where you have this sort of thing, or even like the 30th parallel in the Korean Peninsula, this sort of uneasy peace that I think for sure might be something that in the future, and at least in my lifetime as someone who's not even 30 yet, could be something that we see something hopefully not occur, but it might, that is horrible and leads to, a war. But at any rate, this is why we talk about these issues, to have a sober and hopefully productive discussion and try to brainstorm these types of things and put them together in a way that's as close to reality and the truth as possible, even though we want to caveat that with the fact that nobody, not me, not you, not anybody, can predict the future with certainty. We can, based off of certain information we have now and the historical sources such as the ones I've used in this segment, parse together and sort of make some sort of educated guess, but to ascertain with certainty I don't think is possible. And we only have, as well, a limited amount of time and so much time, so many things to do in such a little time of the day, that it's understandable that these types of things are just, if anything, like a clip or a segment like this is just the beginning of what should be a more broader research effort, especially if you're someone like me who's trying to figure these things out and I think has a vested interest in trying to do so. In the case of myself, being from East Asia, obviously, and I think with others whom, whether you're in the U.S. or someone observing this abroad within Europe or Asia, I think that these are issues that are going to become, if not anything, more important as time passes. But that's my take on this in particular. And I think to end this, actually, because I could talk about John F. Kennedy and Chiang Kai-shek. There are other things. I might even write an article, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. I'll include it below over on Medium and on my other blog at getnuance.com that I'm about to launch, about Chiang Kai-shek and John F. Kennedy, their characters, and the cult of personality as a social technology. Not something that should be looked at inherently negatively, but as one that both Kennedy and Chiang Kai-shek had resorted to in different capacities to consolidate and be able to effectively operate as political actors in their times. And obviously there was different outcomes for both, and arguably both are seen as tragic figures. Actually, I'm going to write that down as one of the main things that they have in common, tragic figures. I mean, both were the Chiang Kai-shek and his wife Sun Mei-ling were likened to the sort of age of Camelot, this sort of mythic period, sort of like this idea of Paradise Lost, where you have this romanticized, idealized conception of a society or an era, a snapshot of a moment in time, which was just more glorious, more pure, more romantic. And I think that the figure of Chiang Kai-shek, along with his wife, Sun Mei-ling, there was this sort of analogy to that at the time by observers, writers, commentators, these types of people like us today who are creating content on such matters, that at least had a slant towards the views that were more friendly towards the ROC, especially considering that Sun Mei-ling in particular had a heavy influence in the perception of the Republic of China abroad, both on the mainland, especially during World War II, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, in terms of her ability to rally support from the U.S., considering that she had connections due to the fact that she was an international student who studied in Georgia, I believe, and also had been the first woman to be from China to have given a joint session speech to the Congress of the United States in order to rally that sort of support for Chiang and his government based in Nanjing, which had to relocate to Chongqing at the time, and thereafter when they had already, had to relinquish, at least for the time what they thought, control of the mainland and flee to the island of Taiwan, formerly Formosa. And at the time, obviously, this sort of thing was important to the PR efforts of the Chiang government, especially on Taiwan, after they had suffered a significant blow to their prestige and had lost the mainland, which is something that Chiang, I don't think, had ever fully gotten over. But I mentioned this because we, like many of us today who tend to look back at more nostalgic times in our past, someone like myself who looks at the early aughts with a sense of sobriety, but can't help sometimes but use rose-tinted glasses due to the greatest moments of my childhood being from that period and having plenty of other memories that were really solid from that time. I understand why people would want to have these sorts of feelings. I know why that they're sort of, instrumentalized in this sense of the analogy to Camelot to the Changs, and even so to JFK, which is why, now that I just think about it, I should write a article as a complimentary piece to this podcast, which I'll include in the description below for sure, and I'll talk about at the end of the segment again, just because I think that this is something that I've just realized while speaking about this right now, and I think it's something that should be further investigated and extrapolated upon, because not only did Chang and Sun Mei Ling were they compared to Camelot, and again, I think really quickly, she was the second woman in history, but the first Chinese person, the first Chinese woman to give that speech to Congress at the time in the 1940s, just a side note. But John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, actually had a similar sort of analogous to Camelot, and especially this was the case after his assassination, and this, like I mentioned before, this gaping sort of chasm that it left in the American consciousness as something that I can succinctly remember being described by my parents, who were baby boomers born in 57 and 58, who told me about that day that they still remember when JFK was assassinated. There was these energies around him, and the aura of his legacy still is very, very powerful today in the American zeitgeist. And it really does invoke this sense of a lost time of innocence and sense of where politics was more functional, even though, just like with Chang, and I think with Kennedy too, which I'll get into in that article that I just mentioned, there sometimes needs to be for us as observers of these events, especially if we're trying to be critical and analyze these things thoughtfully and in a nuanced capacity, a time when we take a step back and understand that perception and reality is fundamental here, and there's a huge chasm between the two, I think, when it comes to being able to understand sometimes the people behind the myth and the actual persons of Kennedy and Chang versus their persona and the public relations campaign that is their cult of personality that really was crucial for them respectively and makes them in many ways what they are to us in posterity. As outside observers viewing these events after the fact, I think it's crucial to keep in mind that there are plenty of kernels of truth here, and like any phenomenal political propaganda from time immemorial, there is always going to be a gray area where interpretation is going to be required to parse together the truth from the exaggerations, the hyperboles, and the outright fictions that are, aiming towards a sense of, building a myth that, becomes why these figures are larger than life. But on that note, I think that that is something that we can further discuss in future segments, and will be something I will highlight in the article that will be complementing this podcast in the near future. On that note, I think that it's good to not get too much into the weeds here. Like any grand adventure, it is not about the destination, it is about the journey, and I think this as a learning process is something that is ever so fascinating and is something that I appreciate, especially considering everything I have to do during the day, and hopefully you all share my sentiments, and I definitely look forward to discussing these things more at length in the future. But for the sake of brevity and the fact, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I'm actually in the middle of not only moving, but I'm also in the process of getting married too, which is a long story, and among other things, I'm quite busy right now, but I will definitely get a complimentary article with where I mentioned other parts of what I wanted to discuss here, and especially more of an emphasis on the cult of personality as a social technology and its role in consolidating and crafting the life and legacy as we understand it of John F. Kennedy and Chiang Kai-shek respectively, as well as its role in contemporary politics with certain figures who I'm sure you're familiar with, relying on these types of tools, whether consciously or subconsciously, to be able to effectively maintain a sort of, public relations, in lack of a better term, project that really is something that, whether you think it's right or wrong, is something that is a phenomenon that we should be paying attention to and understanding to the best of our ability, at least those who can understand these things. As I think without these things being incorporated into our analysis of events, it's impossible to fully make sense of what is going on. And with that being said, hopefully this segment has helped you all just get a little bit more nuanced. I know for me, especially doing these things as of recently off the cuff, it has helped me out loud articulate sentiments that I was already brainstorming, but after doing so out loud, it helped me reassess and gain further insights. And with anything, I'm hoping, just like with all of you, that you're learning and I'm learning every day.
Anyways, though, that's pretty much a wrap for this segment before it gets into the 2-hour mark. My name is Tom, and this has been the Get Nuanced with TJC podcast. And whether you're tuning into the video version on YouTube or the audio versions on Spotify or some other platform that has the podcast, please, if you can, provide a comment and feedback. I would love to hear what you all think. Check out the links to the social media where you can connect with either my personal profile or the show. And if you can, share with your friends and do all the other things like liking and leaving a rating so that the algorithm knows that the show is worthwhile and SEO friendly, so it can further maximize its exposure to the broader world. But for now, regardless of who's tuning in the future, I appreciate those who are now today listening to this, and I look forward to catching you all in the next segment and having a meaningful discussion sometime soon. For now, stay safe, have a solid start to the September month if you're tuning into this at the time of it being initially published, and peace out.